Eh, ¿Tienes un claro esto? ¿Tienes un... Aquí sí que yo lo digo. Ready, Steven.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
You are welcome. We can start this presentation. It's
Okay.
very, very important, and it's an honor for us that you stay here with us, talking about a unified perspective on demand-led growth. Muddy water. Macro is a very nice subtitle. We can start. Carlos is going to make a moderator, so I will give him the microphone.
Welcome, Professor Patari. I'm going to introduce you to all our audience. Profesor Patari es profesor en la Universidad de Washington, más de 35 años. En el 2014 fue nombrado profesor distinguido de Economía Bertie Janet Lynch. Ha sido director asociado del Centro Weidenbaum para la Economía, Gobierno y Políticas Públicas. Ha sido citado, ¿verdad?, en prensa internacional, en el New York Times, en the Wall Street Journal, en the Washington Post, y last but not least, fue el primer director del Departamento de Sociología como economista cuando se reabrió este departamento entre el 2014 y 2019. Thank you, Professor Patari. It's that okay for you. You'll have 40-50 minutes to give us your lecture, and then we are going to continue the event. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Carlos. So it's a pleasure to visit, if virtually, UNAM again. I think my first visit there was probably in the early 1980s, early to mid 1980s. Friends of Clemente Ruiz and Julio Lopez and people that you'll remember well, I know. So it's great to be connecting again, and I'm happy to share these ideas. I guess I should get to it. We had the technology problems, so we're starting a bit late. So let me just jump right in. So yes, a unified perspective on demand-led growth, and now I will explain the title in a second, the subtitle of Muddy Water Macro. So what I want to talk about today is what I'm going to consider a broad perspective on macroeconomics. So I came to Washington University in 1982, so 44. I'm year 44 of my teaching and research, going back to my PhD dissertation. Some of these ideas started way back there, so almost a half a century. It's hard to believe. And so what I'm going to be drawing together in these next minutes is a sequence of individual research papers, and they'll be available on request. At the end, I have a brief bibliography. I'm happy to share slides with anybody who's interested, where you can see more detail about these ideas I'll be pulling together. So at this stage of my career, I'm trying to pull together the ideas that I've been developing really over many decades. So there's also a kind of brand, as we would say, which I'm calling Muddy Water Macro. And let me just go to the next slide, and you can see something here. This is the home page of a website. The URL is up there, called Muddy Water Macro. And so I don't know how familiar people are with this kind of joke in the United States that the more neoclassical supply side, real business cycle universities tend to be next to fresh water, like the University of Chicago next to Lake Michigan, or the University of Minnesota, places like this. Whereas the more Keynesian, new Keynesian sticky price macroeconomics tend to be next to salt water, like Harvard and Princeton next to the Atlantic Ocean, or Berkeley next to the Pacific. So salt water is Keynesian, fresh water is more supply side, real business cycle. Well, I have my unique perspective. And so what is it called? Well, I live at St. Louis, Missouri, which is where the Mississippi and Missouri rivers come together, and they're rather muddy. So I'm calling my new perspective Muddy Water Macro, and it's a way of kind of branding this unified perspective. So that's the logic of this rather unusual subtitle. And you'll see as we move through here, this little this little icon there of the home page, which is actually a chalk drawing done by one of my students some years ago to give us a brand for this perspective. And you know, I'll talk a little bit more about what's on this website as we move through, but I bet we'll move more into the substance of my presentation. So this unified perspective, the muddy water macro perspective, has what I'm calling three foundational principles. So the main components are, number one, that demand drives production and employment. Number two, that there is no at least reliable endogenous mechanism or policy mechanism to push demand to potential output. And through my slides, I'll use Y star as an indication of the resources available, the potential output of the economy. And number three is what might be called hysteresis, that effectively demand growth leads supply growth. If demand is strong, it'll pull supply along with it. If demand is weak, supply growth is going to slow down. If you put these three perspectives together, you will come up with the results that I'll be talking about today. So what I'm going to do is rather briefly go through these three principles and then follow this up with a discussion of policy, a framework for both monetary and fiscal policy. And considering the topic of the workshop or the conference that you're doing there, I was encouraged in my earlier conversation to bring together some initial thoughts about how to connect these ideas to migration and trade. Which is not the main focus of my perspective. I guess I'll apologize ahead of time for being rather U.S. focused in my own research and thinking and empirical work, but this perspective does have implications for the major theme of your conference. So let me jump in right away and talk a bit. There's one slide on this, the first principle, very simple micro foundation. Demand drives production and employment. The idea is really quite straightforward. Firms produce what they expect to sell, and that actual demand drives those sales expectations. And here I mentioned that when I was doing my PhD dissertation around 1980, 1981, this was a kind of motivating factor for me. What is it driving the quantity produced is what's actually sold. It couldn't be more simple. I have a forthcoming chapter in a handbook on heterodox growth theory that talks about this in more detail. And again, I can provide that if people are interested. Another factor I wanted to mention here is the focus is more on quantity, where price is secondary in the determination of output. So this is really a contrast with the more mainstream microeconomics, and especially these new Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, where everything is linked very closely to price and price signals. This is a more straightforward perspective from my point of view, a more simple perspective, which is that output is driven by demand. Prices are basically determined by a markup. And so as a first approximation, there's a kind of independence between price and output. I'm not suggesting price is unimportant, but that basically what's really driving the economy, the quantity produced and ultimately employment, is the dynamics of sales, the dynamics of demand. This is an idea we were developing in our 1998 paper in the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. And these are basic ideas that are elaborated on the Muddy Water Macro website. I have ambitions for the website to develop it further, but if you're interested, I don't know what the audience is there, but if students in the audience just getting some basic intuition about this demand driving production idea, I'll refer you to the Muddy Water Macro website. It's pretty straightforward, it's pretty basic. I hope to develop it more. But that was the logic of developing that site as a resource for understanding this basic idea to a broad audience. Okay, so principle two is a little bit more subtle. And here, there's really two parts. The first one is that wage and price adjustment, nominal adjustment, is ineffective if aggregate demand is less than potential output. If we have an output gap or we have involuntary unemployment, we have a Keynesian problem in the economy, insufficient demand, the kind of textbook idea is that, well, this is because of some kind of sticky prices. And so once wages and prices adjust, the economy should move back to Y star, should move back to potential output, and that in the long run, it's the supply side that drives growth theory. So something like a solo growth model, even the more modern endogenous growth models, have lots of subtle issues in what's driving the long run of the economy, but they're still all supply oriented. What I want to argue is that wage and price adjustment is really not a reliable mechanism to restore demand to potential output. It does not really close output gaps. And again, this is developed in my research going back a number of years. I'll just summarize some of the reasons. The first one is a distributional effect, which is, well, if wages and prices are falling, that in general might be considered neutral for the economy as a whole, but it's going to be bad for people who owe money. If you owe money and prices are lower and your wages are lower, it's harder for you to repay. It's a benefit if you're a creditor, if somebody has to pay you back, and you say they owe you 1,000 pesos and the price falls, well, that 1,000 pesos is worth more. So you might say, well, these things just offset each other. But why is somebody a borrower? Because they spend more. Why is somebody a lender or a saver? Because they save more. So these distribution effects are going to go the wrong direction. These distribution effects make things harder for spenders and maybe better for lenders, but in general, that's going to lead to a reduction, not an increase in demand. Maybe somewhat more direct is the idea of debt deflation. And here my mentor, someone who's also had connections in his career to UNAM, Hyman Minsky, really emphasized these issues, which is that when wages and prices are falling, we get financial instability. It's harder for people to repay their debts, and we have these kinds of financial problems of the economy, which tends to depress the economy, not stabilize it. And then also destabilizing expectations. If wages and prices are falling and people expect them to fall more into the future, then that's going to reduce their spending. So there are these various rather complicated channels through which aggregate wage and price adjustment can be destabilizing an economy. A little bit of a kind of simple historical reference here is that nobody wants deflation in a recession. And so I consider it actually really a kind of a conundrum. It's something I don't really understand on the one hand, that when practical policymakers talk about a recession, I'm thinking of Ben Bernanke in the global financial crisis in particular, he was adamant that we wanted to avoid deflation at all costs, which in some ways is inconsistent with his own textbook, which says that we get recessions because wages and prices don't fall fast enough. As a practical matter, nobody really believes, it seems like, at least practical people, that falling wages and prices are going to bring the economy back to full employment. I know this is a contradiction of textbook aggregate demand, aggregate supply pictures. I used to teach that myself in my introductory courses, but I don't know, probably 20 years ago, I stopped talking about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model because really falling wages and prices was really never the way to get back to full employment. I also, the last point on the slide here is this idea of endogenous money. So if there is some kind of channel through which lower prices, a falling price level, or even disinflation, just a lower inflation rate, will stimulate the economy. It's often called this Keynes effect, this idea that, well, if prices are lower, that means the real money supply is higher, and that will lower interest rates. But in practice, the central bank controls interest rates. We don't need deflation to get lower interest rates. We can get it through policy. This is the idea of endogenous money, and that takes me on to the next slide, which is the second part of the second principle, and that's the problems for monetary policy. So, as a practical matter, no practical macroeconomist these days in my view, is arguing that we should have deflation in a recession to bring us back to full employment. Instead, what we have is this new consensus alternative, that it's monetary policy that brings us back, not nominal adjustment. And this is dominating mainstream macro. But there are problems with the effectiveness of monetary policy. One is pretty widely recognized right now, that especially if we have a large crisis, a big recession, we'll have a lower bound for nominal interest rates. It could be zero, it might be slightly less than zero, but it may not, the cutting interest rates down to the minimum level will not be sufficient to bring the economy back to full employment. But I would go further than this. I don't think it's just about the zero lower bound. And so the second point here, the second problem for monetary policy, is low interest elasticities. That demand is not that sensitive to interest rates in at least most components of demand. If you look at consumption and investment empirical work, you find that the sensitivity to interest rates is really quite weak. In fact, in some ways with consumption, it's not clear there's any sensitivity at all. I've done some work in the middle part of my career on investment and interest rates, and you can maybe get some effect, but investment is only, at least in the US, about 15 to 17% of GDP. So it's a relatively small share. The one place where there is, I think, substantial interest elasticity of spending is with residential construction, the building of new homes. But this is a really small share of aggregate demand. Even at the peak, I think 6 to 7%, right before the Great Recession in the US, and lower than that now. And also that the response of spending to interest rates is likely to be especially low when you need it most in recessions. When people are concerned, their expectations are low, and so it's going to be hard to stimulate much demand through lower interest rates. And then the third problem is again a Minsky kind of point, which is it might be effective to see lower interest rates leading to more demand, but more probably this is going to happen by encouraging borrowing. And over time, if you keep doing this kind of policy, you're likely to end up with financial instability. You just keep pushing debt ratios higher and higher and higher, and eventually this breaks. And my example is the U.S. housing bubble here, where we actually did see some big interest rates cuts, which probably were somewhat effective at stimulating the economy. But eventually we got so much debt that it brought the economy to its knees in an extremely bad recession. So I have a little bit of evidence here. So this is the U.S. federal funds rate going back to the middle 1980s. And what I want to point out here is that really dramatic shifts in these interest rates. So you see in these recessions, the early 90s recession, not a very deep recession, but almost a 700 basis point cut in the interest rate. When the tech bubble burst in early 2000s, 560 basis points. When the housing bubble broke in around 2007, we have a cut of 520 basis points and then get stuck at the zero lower bound for 83 months. I put question marks back there. We're right now, again, in another interest rate cutting point, and we'll see how that plays out. But the point is here that the idea that somehow interest rates are fine-tuning the economy seems inconsistent with this evidence. We have these really massive swings in interest rates that are taking place. So to try to get the economy working with this new consensus, I don't think it's all that effective. This chart is also interesting in this context. When I should probably qualify that point, I don't think it's all that effective. I do think that actually the lower interest rates, the dramatic shifts I just showed, did help stimulate the U.S. economy in these recessions, from the middle 1980s up until the Great Recession. But part of this was a rather historically specific situation where we started off with extremely high interest rates by U.S. standards. I know not so much by Mexican standards, but numbers the 12 to 15% range. This is the 30-year fixed rate mortgage in the U.S. You see this very, very long downward trend. During this period of time, there was lots of room to cut interest rates in the U.S. And it did stimulate the economy, I think, mostly through the housing market. But this was a unique historical period, and I don't think we're likely to see it. I don't think, a coincidence that it's during this period that the idea of monetary policy being all-powerful, it has started to emerge in the U.S. But I think it's misleading. So that this point about monetary policy being the mechanism to bring the economy back to full employment into a long-run supply-driven growth path might have worked reasonably well for several decades, but it was a historically specific period and not necessarily a general solution going forward. Okay, so if I'm a broadly assessment of monetary policy, I probably said this, so that in some historical circumstances, monetary policy may help push aggregate demand towards potential output. But does this by encouraging borrowing and magnifying financial fragility. The effectiveness is questionable over a longer horizon. It's not really a reliable mechanism to restore that old neoclassical synthesis. The old idea was Keynesian effects in the short run when wages and prices are sticky, but in the long run, the supply side rules. This modification in the new consensus was Keynesian in the short run, but in the long run, monetary policy will pull us back to full employment and the supply side will rule. This is my view is that neither of these arguments for why the supply side dominates the long run are really that effective. So I have a big contrast in my unified muddy water macro view with this new consensus. So, third principle, in some ways maybe the most important and a big focus of my own recent research, is that in the long run, it's actually demand that leads supply. I'm turning the textbook of macroeconomics on its head. Some of my students call this the reverse Say's law. Say's law is saying supply creates its own demand. In some sense, my perspective, at least approximately, is demand creates its own supply. And part of the point here is that even if it's the case that demand is driving the economy beyond the short run, we cannot ignore the supply side. If we're going to look at longer horizons beyond the business cycle, and try to understand the growth path of economies, we do have to pay attention to the supply side. I think the economy is driven by demand over long horizons to a large extent, but the U.S. economy could not be producing $30 trillion now if the supply side had not changed over the course of my career. Clearly, that we needed supply growth to get to the level that we are now, and I think the same is true for any economy around the world. So let me kind of elaborate on this idea. How is it that demand leads supply? Again, a very simple model. This paper, which actually I'm very happy with, it was a really important paper in my own career with my co-authors from Italy, Piero Ferri and Anna Maria Variato, was published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics in 2020. And the model's a little bit more complicated than what I have up here on the slide, but the basic idea is there. And so there's two kind of supply side equations. One is the productivity growth, and one is for labor supply growth. And in both cases, they depend negatively on the unemployment rate. And the basic idea here is that if you have faster demand growth in the economy, that's going to lower unemployment. It's going to reduce economic slack. That will lead to faster productivity growth and faster labor force growth. So let me explain this in a little bit more detail. Where are these various channels? And you can make a big list of them. I added this slide just in preparing for this talk, with talking about how a stronger economy, whether that's measured by output gaps or measured by the unemployment rate, how a stronger economy can create supply. On the labor supply side, we have the idea that search costs are going to be lower. If jobs are more plentiful, it'll be easier for people to find a match in the labor market. Also, immigration can be higher. I mean, we're in the U.S., we'll come back to this point at the end, but of course, there's a big crackdown on immigration. But in a general sense, if a country has stronger economy, it's likely to be drawing in more immigrants. Rising wages. If you have a Phillips curve kind of perspective, you lower the unemployment rate, you have a stronger economy, you'll have higher wages, pulling people into the labor force. Something I just saw at a conference a couple of weeks ago is a very interesting discussion of gender and macroeconomics. And one emphasis here is how the care economy is tied into the broader strength of the macroeconomy. And so when the economy is stronger, it's easier for households to afford care services, allowing people to work more outside the home, especially women. On the productivity side, various kinds of ideas. A stronger economy, there's more economic activity, you have more learning by doing, that leads to higher productivity. Another part of my research, again, over much of my career, is the connection between stronger internal finance for firms, their fixed capital investment, and especially their research and development will be stronger when the economy is doing better. There'll be more cash flow and more internal finance that helps stimulate investment in capital and research and development. There's this nice little quip. The idea is that necessity is the mother of invention, which is basically this idea that when you have a scarcity of labor, when firms are having a hard time finding workers because the economy and the labor market is very strong, they'll have more incentive to innovate as we move forward. Kind of dynamic increasing returns, the extent of the market, a stronger market encourages more entrepreneurs, more innovation. And again, on the care economy, you have better opportunities for care, better opportunities for education, developing the labor force. This might be a longer run perspective, but when children are better taken care of, they're going to become better workers. And so you have all these various links between productivity and the strength of the economy. I'm sure we could come up with more. And I want to emphasize the symmetric, unfortunate case, a weak economy is going to reverse all these things. And so a weak economy is going to reduce the growth of supply side. So this generates this result. Now, how can we bring this back to macroeconomics? So here is a diagram which my brilliant graduate student Alejandro Gonzalez from Chile, we've been working together very closely. And he came up with this interpretation of this very simple model on the graphs. It's really pretty straightforward idea. If you're familiar with the super multiplier models, in which a kind of growth of autonomous demand drives growth of the demand path over the long run, that's the kind of foundation here. So the idea here is that the aggregate demand curve is really being driven by the growth of demand components that don't depend on the state of the economy, these autonomous demand components. And so we'll think of that as largely independent of the unemployment rate. So the aggregate demand curve is a horizontal schedule in this growth and unemployment space. The aggregate supply curve is negatively sloped. The idea here being when the unemployment rate is higher, aggregate supply is going to grow more slowly. When the unemployment rate is lower, for all the reasons I just talked about, aggregate supply grows faster. So we see this simple idea. So I think I can use my pointer here. This will work out. So I've got a positive demand shock, an acceleration in the growth of these autonomous components of demand. You can think of this, if you like, as an increase in the growth of government spending, for example, that drives up the growth rate of demand. What that does is push the unemployment rate down. As you push the unemployment rate down, the supply starts to grow faster. And so you have this yellow transition path that's pulling the economy to a new higher equilibrium. So we started with demand equals to supply, so there was no output gap to speak of at a high unemployment rate, but we pushed the unemployment rate down in this long run equilibrium. So this really has some important implications how things go. I mean, the supply path converges to the demand path at this equilibrium unemployment rate. But there's no single equilibrium unemployment rate. There's no single unemployment rate, a natural rate, sometimes it would be discussed, or a NAIRU, such that demand equals supply. The unemployment rate, the equilibrium unemployment rate, depends on the dynamics of demand over the long run. Now, I do want to make a point here that it's not as if you can just grow arbitrarily fast. You can't say, well, I want to grow at 18% or something like that. Well, it's not going to happen. Why? Because there's going to be a lower bound on how low this unemployment rate can get. And it can't be below zero. As a practical matter, it probably can't be below 2, maybe even 3%. But if you look at the U.S. situation, the unemployment rate was 3.5%. We didn't have much inflation. So there could have, I would argue there usually is room for the unemployment rate to fall at the margin, but it's not that this argument would be that we can grow arbitrarily fast. Nonetheless, it is this kind of output gap thinking is to some extent uninformative because at both of these equilibria here in this diagram, there is no output gap. Demand equals to supply, but in the more favorable growth equilibrium at a higher growth rate, we actually have a lower unemployment rate. So I hope that idea is relatively clear. Here's a little bit of evidence, just casual evidence, but I think very, very convincing from the U.S. economy. So let me just describe a little bit what you're seeing here in this graph. So this railroad track line up here is the official output gap measured starting in 2007 and going through 2017 from the Congressional Budget Office. And you see we had a very deep recession, Great Recession, 6% below what was measured as potential output, and a very slow recovery. But by 10 years, we were back to what was considered potential output. But all along the way, the Congressional Budget Office was revising their estimates of potential output. So the potential output estimates are moving as this is going forward. What is this heavy red line? Well, this is the output gap as measured with the potential output forecasts that the Congressional Budget Office was making in 2007. The reason I have a 10-year horizon, it's not updated, is because they do a 10-year ahead forecast. And you can see according to what they thought potential output would be, fully understanding demographics and all these kinds of things, there was no recovery at all. In fact, the economy continued to fall away from the trend they predicted earlier on. My view here is what you're seeing is the deterioration of the supply side from the weak economy. I'm not really arguing that somehow the U.S. economy could have been 12% higher, and some people have estimated this gap is even bigger, in 2017 than it was, but the idea is the supply side has shrunk during that period, which supports, I think, broadly speaking, this kind of hysteresis perspective that the demand side is pulling the supply side along with it. let me just suggest that there's a really important empirical question to be answered here, which is how big is the effect of the economy on the supply side? So I've got two different graphs here with the demand shocks, one with a very flat aggregate supply curve and one with a steep supply curve. So if these effects of unemployment on both labor supply and productivity growth, if they're relatively small, it's going to take a large shift in the unemployment rate to accommodate a given change in the growth of demand. If the supply effects are strong, which is large values of these a steep aggregate supply curve, then you don't need very much change in the unemployment rate. The theoretical argument I think is interesting, but if you say, well, to accommodate a 1% increase in the growth rate of demand, I need the unemployment rate to fall by 20 percentage points. Well, that would be not terribly interesting. But if the decline in unemployment rate is small, necessary to accommodate faster demand growth, then we have something much more significant. And this, in some ways, is maybe the most important slide in my presentation, because this comes from our most recent paper, again with my graduate student, Alejandro, that we estimated this effect. Basically, we're estimating the slope of the supply curve using state-of-the-art econometrics. The paper just came out in Journal of Economic Dynamics and Control, and what we got is a point estimate for this derivative that I'll explain in a minute is negative 0.7, reasonably tightly estimated. That's the confidence interval. So what is this derivative? It's the change in the unemployment rate necessary to accommodate a 1 percentage point change in the growth rate of demand. And so a number that in absolute value is less than 1 is really quite significant. And what it's saying is if demand growth was to rise by 1 percentage point, we would need the unemployment rate to fall by 0.7 percentage points, 70 basis points. Entirely reasonable range, so that it's suggesting that it's more like this, that there doesn't take that big of a change in the unemployment rate to accommodate a quite significant change in the long-run growth rate of demand. And as I put in stars here, this has profound implications for understanding demand-led growth. It's also an important topic for further research. I love this paper. It's my favorite paper in my career, but it is, I don't consider it the last word. This is something that needs to be studied in much more detail. So this is the end of my 3 principles. Let me just discuss the implications of a unified perspective of the muddy water macro perspective framework for macroeconomics. One is there's no supply determined natural rate of unemployment. There's no NAIRU. It does not exist. The level of unemployment the economy is converging to is a function of the path of demand. And as a result, there's no supply side rate of growth that's somehow independent of demand dynamics. It's not the situation that we're converging to some kind of a solo growth path or a more supply-driven path. The supply does not rule the long run. And that ultimately it's the autonomous demand dynamics, the parts of demand that's kind of driving it independently of the state of the economy, that's determining the growth path of the economy beyond the short run. Demand matters beyond the short run. It's a phrase that has been my students and anybody who listened to my talks have heard now quite a bit for the last 20 years. So where am I going to go for the last part of my talk? Forgive my kind of ham-handed way of parroting the current president of the United States and his big, beautiful bill. This is my big, beautiful framework for economic policy. So let me talk both about monetary and fiscal policy, starting out with monetary policy. So I've talked about this some earlier on with my second principle, but what is the new consensus for monetary policy these days? The guiding principle is the neutral interest rate. The objective is to align aggregate demand with the long-run supply growth path and get a zero output gap to achieve the NAIRU, to hit the inflation target. So we have the Taylor rule, we have inflation targeting, we have a lot of sophisticated optimal monetary policy kinds of things, with the idea being monetary policy is the first order of macroeconomic policy to bring the economy back to its long-run supply-driven growth path, and that would push any kind of demand dynamics in the long run into the background. It would get rid of the short-run kind of Keynesian problems in the economy. That's the new consensus. What about monetary policy when demand leads supply? This neutral interest rate does not exist independent of demand dynamics. Demand leads supply. You can get a zero output gap possible, but with suboptimal growth, as my diagrams earlier showed. if there's no natural rate of unemployment, there's no unique interest rate that gets to the economy to that level. So that we cannot ignore the demand side. Monetary policy can be misleading. It might say, "Oh, look, we're at target inflation, unemployment rate is at equilibrium, but we could still be growing much more slowly than is possible." A somewhat more subtle issue is something I've developed in another recent paper in the Review of Political Economy, which is what happens if we have actually stagnant long-run demand growth? And I think of that period between the Great Recession and the pandemic in the US when the economy was really quite weak and growing very slowly. Well, the idea being, well, maybe we can use monetary policy to get things going. It could work to some extent, but the problem is if you have a growth rate below what is possible for the economy based on these kind of demand and supply linkages, if you're above if unemployment rate is not at its absolute minimum, then it's kind of every year you need the interest rate to be lower. So if growth, could be 3%, but you're only growing at 2%, so what do? You cut interest rates. The next year, maybe you push growth up to 3%. But next year, if your longer run trend of demand growth is only 2%, you have to drop interest rates again. So what I've called is this inevitable march of the interest rate to the zero lower bound. If you're trying to year by year stimulate the economy with monetary policy and lower interest rates, you have to keep cutting interest rates, and eventually you're going to get down to the minimum. Again, a lack of effectiveness of monetary policy. So here's another one of my jokey slides. So in the US, the motto on our currency is "In God We Trust," which is kind of strange in a country that supposedly separates church and state. But so I'm going to reject this paraphrase of the motto. We reject in monetary policy we trust, or the various leaders of the Fed. So Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell, and we now know that President Trump is going to send somebody else in there in the spring of 2026. So we're probably not going to be able to rely on these people, in my view, to make sure the economy is always growing at as strong a rate as it could be. So let me go to fiscal policy now. And again, start with the mainstream and then talk about how the muddy water macro perspective contrasts with the mainstream. So very kind of standard dynamics of the public debt to output ratio in this equation. That is, the primary deficit is the share of GDP divided by the growth rate minus the interest rate of the economy. And so in the mainstream perspective, what you have is the supply side determines this growth rate. It's this kind of natural growth rate. The interest rate is the neutral interest rate or the target interest rate that's determined by ultimately savings or thrift and capital productivity, as well as the public deficit. So if you have high deficits, the mainstream argument would be you have higher interest rate. So the denominator is pretty much pinned down by these kind of supply side forces and the basis of fiscal policy. And so then the fiscal responsibility argument is that you should adjust tax policy and government spending, so the share of government spending gamma and the share of taxes tau, to get a low deficit so that you end up with a low debt ratio in the long run. So that's, again, kind of standard story. The idea of, again, the politics are probably deviating from that in many ways, at least in the US context. There hasn't been much serious attempt to cut the deficit, but policymakers are always talking about lowering the deficit, cutting spending, or raising taxes as a way of getting the debt ratio under control, and concerns about unsustainable debt, etc. How does this differ in the muddy water macro fiscal policy perspective? Well, it's that government spending, number one, dominates autonomous demand. So that we have to look at the demand side beyond the short run. And the direct fiscal effects on demand are much more powerful than the indirect effects of monetary policy. In the US, federal spending is about 25% of GDP, if we include some of the social spending for healthcare and retirement. State and local government spending, another 13%. So altogether, someplace between 35 and 40% of the US economy is being driven by the government. In other countries, it's even higher than that. So government spending is central to the dynamics of demand in the economy. And so what's the critical role of government spending growth? Well, it's almost impossible to maintain strong growth if the autonomous demand of 25 to 40% of the economy is facing austerity. So strong long-run economic growth requires strong autonomous demand growth, which almost certainly requires strong government spending growth. And I want to emphasize growth. That's why I underlined it on this slide, because typically we think of fiscal policy as kind of stabilization that focuses on the level of output. That is necessary. I certainly agree that when the economy goes into recession, there's a case for some fiscal stimulus to stabilize the economy. I think it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. That in this perspective, you need to focus not just on the level, but on the growth rate over a longer horizon. Here's a little chart of U.S. Government spending growth, and you can see it as a log scale. You can see the growth rate coming down over time. And there's some time, I don't want to emphasize this too much, but source of stagnation in the U.S. economy. Now, there is a fiscal speed limit. The size of government spending is constrained by the available resources in the economy. You can't drive the unemployment rate to zero, so you do have to pay attention. But these resources shouldn't be thought of as some kind of a hard constraint. They are endogenous to government, just the demand growth. If you have faster government spending growth, you're going to have faster growth of research. Faster growth of the supply side, faster growth of resources. And so a simple example here, suppose we wanted to have a public investment to address climate change in the US, $5 trillion, big number. Over 2 to 3 years, if you tried to do $5 trillion, it probably is too fast. Demand is probably going to run ahead of supply. You'll push unemployment down. You'll probably be inflationary. But over 5 to 10 years, you can exploit the hysteresis. You could exploit the way that supply accommodates higher demand, and this could likely be entirely feasible. It's not like it would crowd out these other things. You'd have a stronger economy over time. What's the kind of broad sense? Are you afraid of government debt in that context? Well, let's think about it in terms of the muddy water macro growth model. Well, again, we have that same steady state debt ratio, but it's important to recognize here, and this is something if I had more time, I could develop it more, but that this gamma, the share of government spending or autonomous demand more broadly in the economy is endogenous. If the unemployment rate is above the minimum unemployment rate, and then this ratio of government spending to the economy is going to converge to the difference between the savings and tax share and the investment share. And when the growth rate rises, in particular the growth rate of government spending rises, you're going to reduce the debt ratio by having a stronger growth rate in the denominator. And you're actually also likely going to reduce this in terms of reducing the share of government spending over time, because a stronger growth rate is going to require a higher investment share. So the gap between saving and investment shrinks, and the government share is probably going to go down. It's not a policy choice. Again, I know that's probably, if you're kind of thinking in a mainstream sense, this might be a bit of a surprise, and I don't have time to develop it in detail. But that is, take my word for it, an implication of this demand leading supply growth model. So there are various complications here. Here's just a striking austerity result, and I want to move to the last part quickly, and so don't completely get rid of our time. I know we're running up against the original end of my period here. I don't want to put you too far behind, but bottom line here is that I've done some correlations between the government spending share and government spending growth. And actually, when you measure it over a longer horizon with a longer term trend filter, so you're looking at long run fluctuations, and you kind of measure it correctly, which I would use as this column, you get a strong negative correlation, really quite surprising at some level, that when you have stronger government spending growth, you actually have a smaller share of the economy that's government spending, supporting that rather somewhat radical view I just talked about. So very quickly, the fiscal policy framework from Muddy Water Macro is to use fiscal tools to guide the growth rate towards full employment and rising living standards. Respecting the fiscal stimulus, the long-run interest rate would be set to control debt service. There is no single neutral rate. It's a policy choice. And so if you're concerned about debt service and the debt to GDP ratio, what you want is a relatively low interest rate and possibly a higher tax rate. Again, the kind of a tax the rich policy could fit there as well. So it's really a very different perspective of this equation than the mainstream. You're not going to be able to control gamma. You can't control tau. But you can control both G and R. There's a lot more flexibility with fiscal policy to affect this debt ratio. Okay, last few minutes here, just attempt to link in this perspective to your main theme of the conference. What about migration? in a globalized world? Well, migration affects labor supply, positive or negative. More migration, positive labor supply growth, less migration, negative. So it's going to affect both of the coefficients potentially here, especially this intercept term. So labor supply will can be higher or lower depending on growth, depending on migration, and actually probably its sensitivity to the economy later. In the U.S. context, the Trump administration is shutting down migration. It's going to make immigration less sensitive to the unemployment rate, which is going to make that supply curve flatter and make it harder to accommodate demand growth. So how much demand-led growth can be accommodated? I think in the U.S. case right now, we have a lower labor supply speed limit. Is it higher for Mexico? If fewer Mexican less of the Mexican population is trying to go over your northern border, my southern border, is that going to suggest that actually you can have a stronger demand growth in Mexico? I leave that as a question. But it certainly would be a direct implication of this model. Finally, what about trade? Well, exports are a key component of autonomous demand. I didn't have time to develop a broader perspective on autonomous demand, but it's not only government spending. Exports also play an important role. Imports, I would argue, are largely induced. When you have a stronger economy, you tend to import more. When you have a weaker economy, you import less. Although clearly policy can affect the level of imports. So if we look at the U.S. deglobalization policy, I think it's somewhat ambiguous in the short run. We might get some possibly lower imports. And also the retaliation on the export side has maybe been less than what one might have expected in the first part of the Trump years, although we'll see how that plays out. And China is using leverage very strongly in the U.S. So there's certainly plenty of room for retaliation against U.S. exports. So in the long run, I think what we would expect in the U.S., if this kind of extreme trade policy is pursued, is slower export growth and therefore slower autonomous demand growth. And which is, going to be a slower growth rate for the U.S. economy. For U.S. trading partners, they're probably losing exports to the U.S. And so again, there's probably more room for domestic demand stimulus in countries that have traditionally been selling output to the U.S. And then my last point here is about trade policy, but also science policy, the way the current administration is treating universities and research and development, is that it is reducing the rate of growth of labor productivity. It's hitting this intercept of the labor productivity growth rate, potentially pretty high in the long run. So again, weakening the economy, so that you do have this current policy mix has been quite negative for the growth of the U.S. economy in the current period. For the growth of the Mexican economy, for the growth of other economies related to the U.S., it also could be negative, especially with the export side, but there is therefore room for stronger demand stimulus outside of the U.S. So this is my little bibliography. It's in the slides. I won't go through all of that. I should probably end right now. So here's my concluding thoughts as kind of a research agenda. So one is that hysteresis estimation. To what extent does demand lead supply? How strong, what is the slope of that supply curve? What are the limits of monetary policy? I've taken a rather strong view that monetary policy is going to be relatively ineffective, at least in the U.S. context going forward. I think that deserves more treatment. Understanding autonomous demand dynamics, what is really driving what? And especially in the longer term, what kinds of feedbacks are there between various pieces of autonomous demand is something that we need to look. What's driving that demand path over the long term? And then my own personal objective is to be communicating and educating people about the MWM project. So I have the website. A big reason I agreed to do this, which I've enjoyed, is I want to be sharing these ideas. And I've mentioned to Andrés and others that I'd be happy to come visit at some point and have a much longer discussion of these issues and develop these ideas in more detail. I'm officially retiring from teaching at the end of this academic year, but I'm not retiring from thinking. And I want to be sharing these ideas as best I can around the world. So thank you for your attention. It's always going to be strange to talk to the little green light on my computer, but hopefully it came across, and I would welcome any time we have for questions, although I realize we're kind of at the limit. So whatever we can do is fine with me.
Really, really thank you, Professor Vasari. It was a great lecture presentation. Now, of course, we have some questions, a few minutes, and so anyone I'm sure.
¿Alguien quiere preguntar algo?
¿Alguna pregunta?
¿Una pregunta? Sí. Wait a moment.
Wait a moment. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Patari. I have, I think, one question about the theoretical framework that you did. In developing countries, the first mechanism to let grow is government spending. I know you told us that maybe it could be the first component and exports, the second could be. But I would like to know if there is a difference in the intensity or the choosing component of autonomous demand to develop and developing countries, because there are growth difference. So in the South America, I am Ecuadorian, so 10 years we had a lot of great spending government for 10 years. And from 2016, the economy couldn't grow. Even with the coronavirus, we have recession, and even 5 years from that, we cannot grow. So I would like to know if you maybe take account this kind of difference between countries in terms of development. Thank you very much.
Should I respond right away? Yeah.
Yes, go ahead, Professor.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a very good question. Actually, as you were asking the question, I should have put on my final slide that. So I apologize a little bit at the beginning for my U.S. focus, and this framework needs to be revised to apply to emerging market countries. And, I recognize that right away. I mean, one thing that's really very clear, and now I'm thinking about it, I should have added it to the slides, is the external balance. In the U.S., we don't have to worry about that so much, at least not so far. I know in Latin America, it's a huge issue. And so actually, Alejandro and I have discussed this, that, I talked about the minimum unemployment rate as kind of a speed limit. I think in developing countries, you have probably 2 speed limits. You should probably ultimately have labor supply constraints as well. But at the same time, you have also the constraints imposed by the external balance and the need to be importing to capital goods and other kinds of things. So I think that's an important recognition and could be a limit on the demand growth. I'm not an expert in these things, but you may have known of the Thurl-Wall's law, the balanced payments constrained growth, which I think should be integrated into this framework, at the very least, to encourage these things. And then, there could be a kind of political economy part of this as well. I mean, I must say in the U.S., with what's happened in the last months, we're starting to be very concerned about this as well here. I think probably in Latin America, the instability of governments over time and the kind of linkages are, creating other kinds of constraints on the economy that could certainly limit demand-led growth in many ways and limit the ability of the supply side to accommodate demand-led growth, given the kind of institutional structures and the way these mechanisms work. So there's plenty of room. I mean, for kind of identifying heterogeneities across different economies in the way in which this very simple framework comes together. I would like to think, nonetheless, that the simple framework is a starting point, and it does kind of identify places to be looking, for the sources of growth.
Thanks a lot, Professor. I read your paper published at the Cambridge Journal. So I have a lot of questions, but I put to right now. One is methodological, let's say, because a lot of the questions are not linear. So a comment about this, because we have problems dealing with non-linear linearities. So this is a methodological question. How we go from a non-linear world to a simple linear work. That's one. And the second one is you use suppose from my perspective a very small capital output ratio in your paper. Some time ago, I read the U.S. economic censuses and check this for U.S. economy and the Mexican one, and this ratio, capital output ratio, is it's 3, 4, 5, 7 times bigger than you use in your paper. So I would like to discuss these points with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Great questions. Again, careful attention to the research beyond just this broad framework. So this, by the way, is the kind of thing that if we have more time, we could talk about and go into more detail. So I'm kind of hopeful that this will be happening going forward. So let me start with the capital output ratio. It's a little simpler question. I worked pretty hard on that in terms of calibrating it. I could share more of the details there. I think there's some of the paper. Interestingly, in the 2025 paper, the one that just came out, we estimate this directly, and it came out almost exactly the same as the 2020 paper. Now, the one clear issue here is how it's measured. So the capital, it's the ratio of capital to output. Those numbers that are around 4, 4.5, often are the capital stock divided by quarterly output, and so versus annual. And so one has to pay attention to the kind of the time dimensions and seeing some of those kinds of things. And I think that might be the reason if you look at some of these, some of the way that the things are calculated. But I'm reasonably confident. That said, let's point, this is empirical work, so you can never tie down anything. We don't know the exact truth. We're not physicists. It's an important issue in the sense that if the capital output ratio is substantially higher, that does lead to instability. And so, these models can be unstable. If investment responds too strongly to the economy, the thing becomes explosive. My sense is that, we tend not to see explosive directions in either thing. So it also suggests that this number there, if you had a number in the kind of annual data that we have, if you had a number around 4, the model would be unstable. So it's an important issue. The bigger question about linearity and nonlinearity, so my first response is a simple one based because I studied calculus 50 years ago, which is linearity is linear function's always a first approximation to a nonlinear thing, simple Taylor rule expansion. But I think that nonlinearities could be important here, especially in those simple productivity equations I laid out. That simple things there, should this necessarily be linear? I would guess probably not. That there's probably some reason for nonlinearity and how strong the economy, how strong something like productivity growth responds to the unemployment rate. And so that's certainly a useful topic going forward for further research. If you added some nonlinearities to that aggregate supply curve, it wouldn't change the theoretical story that much. But it could change the magnitude. If the aggregate supply curve gets flatter and flatter as unemployment rate gets, changes, we could there could limit the practicality there. So there's plenty of room for work there.
Thanks a lot, Professor. I'm sure Andrés Blancas has some words. I'm sure.
Thank you, Carlos. Congratulations, Stephen. Your point of view, your approach of muddy waters macro is very interesting. I have never been or hear this approach only with the grand loose musician muddy waters. And you talk about muddy waters.
Yes, I have to link into there's New Orleans jazz in some respects has also gone this way, but probably much more culturally interesting to the vast majority of the population. Well, maybe not to the people in your room right now.
Yeah. I have some points, a couple of points. First of all, we are very interested also now yet several years ago that Jaime Minsky stayed here and we hear and we learn and we are learning still lot of Minsky theory, and you are exposing the main points about that. So I would like to consider this financial instability and debt deflation approach that you are pointing out in your exposition. So this topic, the debt deflation and Minsky financial instability, it's also present in many countries, like in Latin American and countries that have a lot of problems with debt, public debt, and mainly external debt. So Minsky is present here. I mean, the interpretation of, or the way in which Minsky considered this problem for the capitalism in nowadays. So I would like to know what is your opinion about the depth of the Mexican or the Latin American countries, and with the meaning of the financial instability or financial fragility. By the way, one of my students in PhD program are very interested in trying to develop this research in the financial fragility in our countries. So your point of view is very interesting in this way. The other point is about the very nice way in which you are including or considering this globalization topic and the topic of the seminar, which is the globalization and free trade. And you told me when I invited you that you can talk, or you can invent, you can think about some very nice topic, and this is very nice, that the way in which you are trying to consider this, what you are exposing, and talking about migration and globalization. So the way in which you are trying to expose this point, I mean, the exports, the imports, migration, but what is your opinion about, or what is your consideration about the foreign direct investment in this topic? Because, you know, internationalization of the capital is through the foreign direct investment and also foreign indirect investment, I mean, debt. So what is the role of this variable in this discussion?
Well, those are two good questions. One, I feel like I have something to say. The second one, less so. But let me just talk a bit about Minsky. Again, the connections are significant. My first visit to Mexico was with Hyman Minsky, and this was around the time of the early 1980s debt crisis, and the financial instability in Mexico in particular. So yes, I think his insights are really important. They're, in terms of the framework, the way I've talked about it right now, I mentioned the connection, my second principle, the idea that somehow wage and price adjustment is not going to be sufficient to bring the economy to full employment, I think clearly has strong Minsky connections. Also, the skepticism, or a somewhat skeptical and nuanced view of monetary policy and what it can do and what it cannot do. Again, the simple kind of mainstream new Keynesian macro models have a Taylor rule or some monetary policy rule. It's just very, in some ways, the technical details can be very complicated, but the basic idea is very simple, and it doesn't account for the fact that when you're changing interest rates, this whole financial fragility issue is really suppressed in the mainstream way of looking at things. And I think this is directly relevant to the perspective here. Another way which I didn't develop the Minsky connection in my talk, but I think is relevant, is really one of the last research points, which is how do we understand how economies move through time? How do we understand the trajectory of demand growth? And the idea that stability is destabilizing is really a perspective on what is a more developed model of longer term demand growth. The US experience of the housing boom and the consumption boom, something I've called in my other work the consumer age, from the late 1980s until around 2006, 2007, is just such a strong story for how the economy was generating its demand to keep going reasonably well in the US case, but was ultimately debt financed in a way that led to its collapse. And this, is I think a perspective that really, we learned from Minsky. I wish I would have understood it better when he was with me. He was my colleague at Washington University, and then for a few years after he retired, before he passed away. And I didn't appreciate it as much until much later. But there's just some really deep insights there about what drives the economy over a longer horizon. And I think relevant also to the international context. Again, literature I'm not that familiar with, but I think a lot of people have used the Minsky perspective and try to apply that basic stability is destabilizing perspective to emerging market countries. And that's certainly work that we need to pay attention to. And in broad sense, I mean, more people around the kind of post-Keynesian world more broadly are paying attention to this autonomous demand dynamics, the endogenous supply, and financial instability. So this is a big research area. Foreign direct investment, and how does that fit into this perspective? Yeah, I mean, I did agree. When you invited me, which I appreciate very much, I said, well, the topic is a little far away from the kinds of things I think about, but I will try. And you saw my events, and it's been useful. It's really been useful for me to think about it, especially in the context of the disruption that is happening to the world economy these days, and how this fits through. So I hope to develop those ideas further. Foreign direct investment perspective, trying to see more global supply chains in some respects. I think one of the things we saw in the pandemic, and I'm somewhat speculating here, is that trying to squeeze every last bit of short-term efficiency out of global supply chains can be troublesome. And that we, in a world where everything is smooth, where everything is, tomorrow is very much like yesterday, and things are moving along, we can kind of diversify internationally. And that I think, since the pandemic especially, I'm speaking more on the US context, there's been at least one step back away from this idea that hyperglobalization is the best way to have a more efficient production. And so, and now, of course, the pandemic was not policy induced, but now the Trump kind of chaos in some respects is I don't quite know where it's going to go in this context. I mean, you would think it would be backing off of globalization. You would think at least of U.S. firms is saying, well, we better be more concerned here. But then you have the emergence of China and how it's, in some ways, what's happening in the United States. I think many people see it as a opportunity for other countries to maybe diversify away from the U.S. as kind of the demand leader. The source of demand is last resort. Try to use that phrase, is that the U.S. trade deficit has been kind of global demand stimulus over time, and maybe what's happening now is a movement away from that. That's not so much directly foreign direct investment, but at least it's another perspective on connecting the globalization to this more demand-led growth process. If I wanted to say, I know we're probably out of time here, so maybe a good final comment would be along these lines, which is that this perspective, if you step back, is one that says it's not that we can ignore supply. We shouldn't ignore supply and what's been happening and what happens there. It's just that we cannot ignore demand. That macroeconomics has been structured, for decades around the idea that if we're thinking about growth beyond the short run, so we're going beyond the business cycle frequencies, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, that what's happening demand is actually going to matter over that horizon. in this sense. And so it's kind of putting the two things together. Sometimes I talked about in my classes the dance between supply and demand that we have to pay careful attention to. And so much of the mainstream just pushes demand off the table once you go beyond the short run. So that's kind of my general view, and I think that perspective needs to be brought into these discussions of globalization.
Okay, that's very interesting what you are saying. I hope that for the next year you stay here in person in this seminar. I will invite you. Very nice.
Thank you. I'll look forward to it. Send me an email a bit earlier, and I can plan.
Yeah.
I'll have more flexibility. I won't be teaching. I'll be retired officially. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, but finally we talk with you by this media. Okay,
Thank you. My pleasure.
Somebody, ¿alguien más?
Time to
Rodrigo? No? No. Okay, that's it.
Professor Fasari, thanks a lot again.
Thank you, Carlos.
We'll see you here next year. It's time to close this magnificent lecture you with us. So thanks a lot. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Professor Fasari. See you soon.
Gracias.
Gracias, hasta luego. Ahí va, si quieres ya.
Es tiempo de ya la siguiente mesa. No sé quién modera. Espero que lo haga mejor que yo.
No, estuvo bien. ¿Cómo termina? ¿Sí?
Sí, ¿no crees que vamos ahí un poco mejor?
Hay un moderador, primero empiezo yo y luego
Sí.
Sí, porque se mueven los ponentes.
Héctor, ¿verdad?
Estoy pensando en